Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stand, Speak, Shine. I'm Cherie Burton, and this is a podcast for those who long to feel, express, and be who they truly are. My soul sister in the Middle East, Moriah Chenthitta of the Temple of Divine Radiance, is our guest today. You know, occasionally I'll have guests come back. I'll invite them to come back that I've previously interviewed because I can just see how their work has deepened. You know, they're bringing even more depth and enrichment to the conversation of the empowerment of the feminine, and she is definitely one of those. She took a little bit of a hiatus, and I missed her voice. And so, you know, when she came out metamorphosing, I reached out to her and said, hey, I'd love to have you back. And so this episode is born of our reconnection and of what has come through for her in terms of the genesis of her work and the evolution of what she's gifting to this planet, which is in the form of sound healing. And a lot of times we hear about sound healing, but the way that she has put this together, specifically in reference to the goddess and how to find our own authentic voice through the vibration of words, beats, music, sound, mantras, chanting, and that kind of thing, is really, really fascinating. There's no denying that the feminine is rising, and this eternal feminine voice, she is coming out of exile after thousands of years, anchoring in a new reality in our time. Lisa is a writer, artist, drummer, Aramaic mystic, qadosha, which is an Israelite priestess, creative catalyst, soul sounds coach, and communication consultant based in Dubai. Her guiding truth is to live a life of service completely called forth by the power of her own voice in partnership with divine truth. She's also the co-founder of the Story Alchemists, a boutique personal brand and communication agency for maverick souls, and founder of Temple of Divine Radiance, an online sacred space devoted to Hakhimtoh, or wisdom, the biblical Jewish manifestation of goddess. You'll hear how she, like me, came from a very conservative upbringing and how she found herself called to study things kind of outside of her tradition of origin, including sacred text and the language of the goddess. Please follow us on Instagram. Lisa's Instagram is Temple of Divine Radiance. Mine is Cherie.Burton. Also, if you have not received my free mini training on the new feminine leadership paradigm, go grab that at CherieBurton.com or StandSpeakShine.com. If you ask to join my private Facebook community, you will automatically be given that freebie. The Facebook community that you ask to join is Stand, Speak, Shine Community. So let's further our discussion on unlocking your authentic voice. Lisa, what a privilege to have you today. This has been a long time in the making, us actually having this interview. You and I went through transformative periods just to be to this place where just talking to you before we started recording, it feels so divinely timed that you actually were on a very parallel journey with the Magdalene, which we'll get into, but so affirming. Your place in my life has just been so affirming. So I'm grateful to have your presence here.
Oh, I am utterly delighted to be here. And I echo your sentiment. The time feels right now in a way that it never has before. So I think we can say it was worth waiting for.
I think so. Well, let's dive in. I know you're in Dubai, and it's a place on my bucket list, actually, just because from Mission Impossible, looking at it, that's my exposure to it. But
you and a lot of people, yes.
You're like, there's a little bit more to us than that. But I'm intrigued because you and I share, you interviewed me, which I aired a while ago. Well, it's been a couple months now, where I talked about my faith transition and how really you brought that out in that interview and helped me to sort of frame things as I was speaking them out. And when I talk about being on parallel journeys, I mean, you have a very traditional Christian background. I'm pretty sure it was evangelical. How long ago did you start to, let's just giving people a little bit of background and timeline as to your own transformation and your own awakening process. Whatever you want to share for that in terms of, the space that you inherited from birth and grew up in and sort of marinated in, and your point of, I guess you could call it awakening or transition, but however you want to frame that for us and share with us, just to give us that context.
Yes, yes. I was born into a fundamental Baptist community, which broadly evangelical, but the very conservative end of evangelical. So we are talking everything laid out for you in terms of how everything should be done in life from birth to death. A very literal reading of the Bible, no conversation about the divine feminine or goddess. I mean, I probably couldn't have even uttered the word goddess. Like, I'm not sure I could have gotten it out of my mouth for many years because it was just so taboo. And in many ways, I did have a beautiful upbringing, and there were gifts I received. I can see that now, having done a lot of work. I can recognize where there was wounding, and also recognize the gifts that upbringing gave me. But I didn't. I was very intelligent. I traveled a lot in things, but I didn't really live beyond the community or the culture all that much, even into my early adulthood. If I showed up in any secular space, I would have seemed, fairly well adjusted and very, very intelligent and contribute to the conversation. But when it came to social things and to how life was lived, it was very much prescribed by the community. I even married within the community. My first husband was a Baptist pastor's son. We met in a Baptist Bible college. We were going to serve as missionaries abroad, although that never happened.
Wow.
We were married for 7 years, and several months into our 7th year of marriage, he announced one day that he was not happy, had never been happy, and wanted a divorce. And this was earth-shaking to me at the time. My wiser, older self would have seen the signs, much earlier, but my young, fairly naive and self with such a limited experience didn't. And it was devastating and humiliating and shameful because of the background we came from. Now, we had done a little bit of exploring outside of our denomination. I was 33 at this time. And we had gone around, we had visited different denominations. We had thought about getting outside of our evangelical bubble, but we had never fully made a shift. And I certainly had never had to make a shift like that on my own. But everything was very fast with this divorce. It was like one day he told me this, 2 weeks later, or 3 or 4 weeks later, our house was on the market for sale. I was moving like a month later. The divorce was finalized in under 6. It was a whirlwind. Like, I woke up in October of that year, at the end of October, and my life, I didn't even know where it went. I lost almost everything financially. I lost 70, 80% of what I owned and ended up giving the rest away later. Like, just what I realize now is that I was being invited into total dissolution in order to transform. But of course, at the time, I didn't understand that, and I fought the process, I'll be honest. Eventually, I got wise to what was happening. But the space created by that enabled me to start exploring spiritually and to begin to read and study from all kinds of other traditions. I began to have a greater connection to my intuition. I started to receive messages more in the divine feminine kind of prompting, sort of way. And I was listening to those more than I was reading the sacred text I had grown up with, this type of a thing. So I ended up selling what was left of what I owned, as I mentioned, and went on the road and traveled. And no money, no home, no title, no real agenda. I was completely dissolved in this cocoon, being refashioned. And during that time on the road is when I actually met my first Magdalene mentor, who recognized, the signs in my journey that there was probably some kind of connection to Mary Magdalene, which felt familiar because I had grown up in a Christian tradition, but was also terrifying because she was bringing in all this goddess, this person I was working with, bringing in all this goddess language. And I read Dance of the Dissident Daughter by Steve Monk Kidd during this time.
That literally was a catalyst for me. Yeah. Her book. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Same here. And I read it with it like under the covers with like one eye, like waiting to get struck by lightning, that I was reading this book. Right. And it took me years to actually feel safe with it.
Yeah,
totally. But I am very grateful, fast forward several more years. It's now been 7 years since that journey began, and I've come a long way and happily use the word goddess. And, have both had an opportunity to heal my relationship with my tradition of birth, and also begin to forge a path that I feel like, for me anyway, brings together what I loved and received from that heavily masculine tradition, with also what has blessed and nourished me so much from the feminine as well. I see them as being unified, and I really love having them both in my world. I don't want to give either one of them up.
Yeah. It's like, why can't we, what is the fear really? Like you said, you're like under the covers, and like, what was bred into you that would happen if you explored feminine spirituality?
That is a very good question. That's actually a fantastic question, because I don't think anyone ever articulated out loud, do not explore goddess spirituality or feminine spirituality, the eternal feminine, as I often like to say, because you will be struck by lightning. No one ever said that.
Yeah.
It was more of this idea that there was something so shameful and dirty and unspeakable, often because of the way that certain scribes in history who were compiling texts that became the Hebrew Bible wrote about the traditions that had come before, and how those traditions were overturned in the Hebrew temple, for example, in book of Second Kings. Even the way that even the serpent, that story is written in Genesis. I mean, that sets the stage right there. In fact, I now move in a lot of Jewish spaces, and there are many rabbis who've observed that the whole Torah, in many ways, the first 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of what Christians would call the Old Testament, or Jews call the Hebrew Bible, those are essentially a polemic showing the people why they need to give up their old goddess ways and take on this, more masculinized, so all of that teaching, the subtextual message was, this is dangerous, it's vile, it's dirty, it's bad, and it will harm your life, because see, we had to get rid of it. And look at all the women out there this is something that was actually said to me, like, look at all the women out there who are just angry all the time and mad, and they don't have the loving community around them that you do, because they've rejected it, and they're trying to reclaim these dangerous things. It's going to harm them. It was those types of messages. And it's funny, because in the rest of my life, I was deeply intellectually inquiring and had very thoughtfully formed opinions, and was encouraged to have them. Education was a very high value in the community that I came from.
Same.
But in that one area, no.
That was the taboo.
No.
We actually had some very public, visible excommunications of prominent Mormon women who were speaking out for ERA in the 70s.
Oh, wow.
And I grew up just thinking, oh my gosh, those angry feminists, they're on the road to, they don't get it. They've been deceived. They're on the road to, and I really didn't understand feminine fierceness, feminine fire that wasn't held up. Yeah. The phrase that kept coming to me is no other gods before me. So it was like worshiping a goddess was idolatry. And that you referenced, the temple, Asher's temple that was, basically destroyed, I think in 600 BC, around that time. I don't know. Yes. Is it King Josiah or something's time? Which in Mormonese and in my Mormon tradition, that was the time that the Book of Mormon actually started, 600 BC, that they left Jerusalem and purportedly came to the Americas. And I find that so interesting, that time in history was, I feel like, a huge split, a huge rift.
Huge. Epic. Yes.
Yeah. So let's, I want to come back to that. But so like you were just feeling like, okay, so if I go into this territory of the goddess, then I am betraying God, maybe? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was it destruction based, or was it more, I'm going to cause God pain and reject God if I embrace this mother?
It was both. I think you've articulated it very well. There was that sense of lightning will strike me, metaphorically speaking. Right. Something bad will happen, but also there was a relationship there with God as Father and King that had in many ways nourished me. And I will say the one blessing I received is that I learned ways to interact with God in the masculine as loving. So it wasn't all judgment based in the tradition that I grew up in, but there was this sense, well, I don't understand. How can there be one God as, as my tradition taught? And we could get into the discussion of whether the Trinity is really one God, but that's how it was presented in my background, and going all the way back to the Jewish Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord God is one. How do I hold that and love God but also goddess. But that's more than one, isn't it? How does that work? I couldn't wrap my head around that at all.
Exactly. Just that singularity of God, the sovereignty of God. It was always unquestionably masculine. It was Father God, Father. Prayer was addressed to Father. So in my upbringing, it was like you're diminishing Father by turning to a mother. It was like you said, it was never officially stated that way. It was just like, we don't worship her. That's it. We just don't worship her. There's actually a Sunstone, kind of like a Mormon think tank subgroup of Mormonism called Sunstone Symposium. And they actually had an article that I read called How to Pray to Heavenly Mother and Not Get Excommunicated. So a lot of this real deep wounding around shutting people down for going on that route to find her.
Yeah.
So when did you give yourself permission? At what point were you like, okay, I'm a find her?
That's a great question. I think it started around the time of my divorce, because once that relationship, which had been very inorganic in my life, was removed swiftly, there was space. And in that space, all of this intuitive knowing, magical consciousness, and different things began to arise against my will. But eventually I had to admit that it was happening. And I think that was probably the unspoken seed of it. When I had a very defined, first experience with the Magdalene in Phoenix in the desert in 2017. And I was reading Suma Kid's book by not by happenstance, by synchronicity at the same time. That was when I think I gave myself actual permission, but I still lived in I was exploring. One side of me was exploring and unafraid. The other side was fearful. And I would say that that's gone back and forth, ever since, until this last year, where I really gave myself permission to speak about it. I wrote a book, etc., on these topics. But even then, I couldn't really fully, it's taken me even the last 9 months. And actually, ironically, being in Jewish spaces where people are more willing, progressive Jewish spaces, where they're much more willing to speak about the loss of the feminine and to, change prayers to address God as goddess or as mother, change the feminine, the gender in Hebrew from masculine to feminine, and these types of things. That's where I really have felt the most permission to really fully, even to use the word goddess.
Are you talking about
in ways that I couldn't have even a year ago?
Yeah. That's so beautiful. And you probably didn't have the awareness that you were drawn to that until you got there. My question is,
yes.
What is the difference between, let's just say, mystical Judaism, the mystical Hebrew, like the Kabbalah, versus we're saying progressive Judaism?
So mystical Judaism is a tradition that has existed for thousands of years. In fact, even though most people look at the Zohar as being the central text of Kabbalah or mystical Judaism, probably it was based on ideas that had been orally passed down for at least 1,000 years before they were captured in print, and maybe even went all the way back to the first temple. So there's a long history there. Progressive Judaism is a modern phenomenon. Jews lived once after the temple, destruction of the temple, and after exile began in around the 600s BC. Jews have been, for on and off, most of the time they've been in diaspora ever since. There have been periods where they were able to return to the land, such as a time when Jesus was walking the earth. They were in their land then, but for most of the time they've been in diaspora and unable to have that connection to Eretz Yisrael, to the land, and so they weren't citizens. It wasn't until the 18th century, actually, that Jews began to get full rights as citizens in Europe, for example. And at that time, they began to say, how do we, now that we can live as members of the community without being ostracized, how do we participate as members of states like every other citizen and also maintain our Jewish identity? And so progressive denominations arose during that era of looking at how do we be modern Jews. And so progressive Judaism, Yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm also mindful of the Essenes, like the Essene community.
Yes.
Weren't they more Judaist? Well, they were offshoot of Judaism and they were more mystical. Well, I don't know if they were super mystical, but a lot of people believe that Jesus was an Essene, or his mother and her tradition.
Yes. Yes. The Essenes were one of, as I understand them, one of many sects during that era that were not fans of the Second Temple and of the rabbinic tradition. It can get more complicated and nuanced than that, but the general gist. And so a lot of the anti-Jewish sentiment that filtered into Pauline Christianity, or was fomented, I guess you might say, in Pauline Christianity, and led to a lot of the later persecution and things like that. The seeds were laid for that in these dissident communities that saw the early Jewish rabbinic tradition as apostate. And the Essenes would have been one of those groups, likely, who would have felt that. They didn't go to this. My understanding is that
yeah. So I've read mystical things about the Essenes, and I know a very small amount of, like, just with the whole Ark of the Covenant thing, right? And what was found with that. And those are Essene scrolls. So the raising of this goddess temple and the whole offshoot group of, like, that was not cool that happened, that we literally exiled Mother. We exiled Asherah, we exiled the goddess. So they went into exile to maintain worship, or at least honor of that Mother, or the eternal feminine, as you put it.
I think that is one way to look at it. I think sometimes in modern context, we like to assign them that task in a very direct way. I don't know that they thought about it exactly like that, but that's the general gist. I know that they probably saw that there was wisdom that had been lost, that they were preserving. The ironic thing is, because all their documents disappeared until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, as you just mentioned a moment ago, it was actually the rabbinic tradition that preserved the memory of goddess that we have today, even as they attempted for many centuries to overwrite it and subvert it. It's really fascinating, actually.
Which is a whole other for me split.
When I started to realize that.
Yes, that's so fascinating. Yes. Because that's a whole other split. And so you just look at all these traditions that formed from this exile, if you will, in trying to preserve.
Yes, many.
So when you look at, by the time Christ and Mary Magdalene, because I didn't know that you had a desert experience with the Magdalene in 2017. And you and I were literally paralleling, because that's when the call of the Magdalene happened for me. I was reading Dance of the Distant Daughter that very year. I went on a Sacred Mary Magdalene pilgrimage and had an absolutely beautiful, what I can only describe as direct experience with Magdalene in 2018, June. So you and I were very much on this parallel path. And I actually know a lot of people, whatever that time period was on the earth for feminine consciousness, because Suma Kid's book came out in like the 90s, didn't it? I mean, I want to say it came out in the 90s.
Something like that. Yeah. Yes.
But here, almost 20 years later, people are finally like, oh my gosh, it's finding traditional Christian, women in traditional Christian spaces as like, oh my gosh, this is like, she is articulating exactly. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that you're having this desert experience. I'm in France, having a direct experience with the Magdalene. Anything you want to share around that? It seems like that 2017 time was a pivotal piece for you to dive really into all this. Like, you're a plethora of like history knowledge around this, but did you feel like that was sort of your opening? Do you feel like that's what she was urging you to really point to, that history, the true history?
Yeah, I think there was sort of layers, there's like layers to the onion, right? Things keep peeling away. At first, it was just about me acknowledging that there was a feminine path within the tradition that I came from and the larger stream that it ultimately drew from originally, which of course now I understand, like, oh, this is the Hebraic Semitic tradition. This goes all the way back to Mesopotamia. But the original Magdalene teaching I received was connecting Magdalene with Egyptian spirituality, which is very common in the mystical community.
Egyptian, is that what you said?
Makes sense.
Did you say
Egyptian? So
okay.
like Isis,
Sure. Yes.
and goddesses Hathor, that whole tradition, and that did not resonate for me. It did not resonate at all, which is part of the reason why I fought the whole, like, I'm like, this isn't my thing. But Magdalene was, she was kind of, that consciousness was drawing me out of that experience, and it set me on the path to discover my direction.
Her texts were found in Egypt, correct? The Gospel of Mary Magdalene,
yes.
Gnostic spirituality, that was all found in Egypt.
It was. However, one could make a case that a number of those manuscripts weren't from there originally.
Sure.
And Magdalene, of course, is located distinct. Yes, and Magdalene is distinctly located within Christian tradition, and the tradition that was preserving that wisdom was still very much aligned with Hellenic thinking or Greco-Roman thinking. Egypt was part of the Roman Empire at that time, and that is it's one direction you can go, and if you go that direction, you get into Christianity from sources. The other direction is to go the Semitic Hebraic route, which ultimately takes you back into Mesopotamia. And that's where I found my home. But I needed that start. It gave me what I needed to acknowledge initially, there is a feminine path within the tradition that I come from. And then the ask over time became very urgently, go back to origins, look beyond me. I'm pointing you somewhere else. You need to keep moving back in time. Where you are meant to be is there. Yes.
That's exactly. That is a very Magdalene, like, look at the true history is an underpinning I get from a lot of women and men who are feeling a connection to Magdalene. And I want to say as an archetype, not just an actual historical presence, but it's an archetype as well.
Yes, for sure.
So you were drawn into this desert experience, and did you kind of recognize that as like a line in the sand, literally, like desert sand? Like, was it a turning point for you for deeper inquiry?
It was. I can't say, as I said, that I participated without resistance and anxiety at all times from that point forward.
That's what happens. That's when it all unravels, actually.
Yeah, exactly. That is when, things had already started to unravel, but that's when it really, 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 it got weird from that point in my life compared to what I had known before. And I felt a very different consciousness in my space, in my body, around me. I started to have different experiences. And I do look back at that as being tremendously pivotal experience in my life that made almost everything else after it possible.
Wow. So so when you started diving in and you really, can you paint a little bit of the unravel? I think there's a lot of people that I attract into my space who are in transition, who are in sort of a dark night of the soul. They're really pining for that direct experience, that gnosis, that oneness.
Yes.
The experience of God, if you will, versus just the learning about it and being told what your spirituality needs to be from birth. So can you maybe just briefly, before we go into a little bit more of the history, can you walk us through what that was like for you to kind of unravel? You said it was like that point of no return, really. Like once you start to lift the lid and once you have that direct experience, or when it calls to you and you say yes, there's really no going back. You're like in it.
That's true. Even if you try to go back, whatever structures you try to re-implement in your life from the old way, they're going to break probably very quickly because they just no longer fit. Some of the things I noticed during that season were that I felt very disconnected from almost everything. This was the point where like a lot of my community fell away and I was alone a lot. I couldn't, no matter what I did, I couldn't put some of the normal structures back in my life, like have a normal job, live in one place. Like I ended up traveling and living out of a suitcase. I was doing that during that time, and then it continued. I couldn't have a title to call my own. I couldn't even really have an identity that I could find to live in. There was consciousness that was rising up in me that had never been there before. There was a lot of emotion that was coming out of me that was unprocessed trauma, of course, collective and personal around the feminine. And then there was also this urge to like hyper curl into and return to the tradition I had come from because, well, it was just safer and let me just anchor deeper. I tried that for a while.
You double down.
Very well.
That's a natural response.
Double down. Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. So, and I think the biggest thing for me was that nothing in my life resembled what anybody would call safe or structured anymore. Mm-hmm. And instead of seeing this as part of the process, because I just, there wasn't really anybody, I guess, at that moment who could say that to me, I saw it as being a problem. Like, here was the proof, right? All of that subtextual that we were talking about earlier, all those subtextual stories about what happens to women who let the feminine, the eternal feminine, the like big feminine back into their lives or try to go after that, they end up in ruin. And most people would have looked at my life and been like, yeah, there's not much going on there right now.
Yeah, during that season. It's like for people on the outside who love you and care for you and we're part of your community, whether it's family or dear friends or whatever, they literally look at your unravel like, well, that's what happens. That's what happens when you get deceived by Satan. Everything falls apart. See, we told you. And that even if they're not saying that voice is in your head because you were warned about
it is in your head. 100%.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, totally.
So what was your anchor? Like, what gave you perspective to continue and not? Because some people, I will say, Lisa, I have been exposed recently to the idea that there are many people who start down this path. And when I say you can't turn back, there are people who try and they, I'm actually aware of some people, and you could call it spiritual awakening. There's so many words for it that I don't even like to put label on it, but they stop dead in the middle of it because they cannot take it mentally. And they experience a form of psychosis, you could say, because their worldview has just unraveled. And all the safe holds, and you said there was no structure, right? So all the strongholds, all the anchors, when those fall away, they begin to experience terror. And I don't mean to like make this so dismal, but I have actually experienced that myself, where I thought I was literally going crazy, and I had no evidence that I wasn't. So that's when my mentors came through, and mind you, I'm doing the podcast this whole entire time. Wow, which was an anchor for me. I started the podcast the year I turned 50, so in 2019, which is at the apex of sort of my, what you would call, I guess, a faith crisis or a deconstruction process.
Yes.
So I bring that up only because, like, in asking you, what kept you moving into, were you still getting mentored? Did you have a safe tribe? Did you have a community that was affirming for you?
I actually did not have a community. At various points, I would have touches with an affirming community, but I didn't really have that. However, I did when I could. And there was, I was miraculously sustained and taken care of during this time, which has enabled me to continue to dance with mystery very effectively now because I trust that provision. But there was provision that was given to me at various points I was able to use for coaching and mentoring. And I do very well in a one-on-one type of context. So I made sure there was always someone in my life that I could connect with. And I was always reading. That was an anchor for me, listening to podcasts, trying new practices. So I stayed in touch with that search for wisdom, really. And of course, I learned very quickly, in this journey, you cannot rely on knowledge solely, but that was safe for me. I could read and connect with that. And there was always, for me, ever since I've been young, this deep, burning, unshakable conviction that I would be given something as a gift to give back to the world at some point. And not to overblow it and make myself some kind of, person that I'm not. I think everyone has access to that for themselves, whatever it is. Some people might be more aware of it at the various points in life than others, but for me, that sense has always been there. And on my darkest days, I would always tell myself, someday you're going to talk about this. You can see the whole thing with voice, which is important to me coming out. Someday you're going to talk about this, and it's going to be part of someone else's story to help them, and you have to hang on for that. You cannot let go in the middle, because there's going to be something. I didn't know what, but I couldn't let go of that belief. If I had let go of that belief, I think I would have ended up, severely incapacitated. But that was the thing, and I developed a very keen relationship with intuition and divine wisdom and prompting. And I kind of learned how to surf the uncertainty, as I like to say, by following those nudges. And for a very long season, I got busy following the nudges, and that also gave me something to focus on more than the overarching uncertainty of my life. I could focus on that relationship. I wasn't really sure what it was. I guess I would have called it the Holy Spirit for many years, coming from a Christian background.
Which is
but
very feminine. They co-opted that. It's very feminine.
Very feminine. Yeah, for sure.
How beautiful. So you just had this inner knowing that you would be a voice to whatever was happening within you.
Yes.
Alchemically, if you will. It was the same for me. I have to say, maybe that's why I kept with the podcast, because using my voice, which let's talk about that.
Yes.
That's a very beautiful specialty of yours. It's something that, we go through seasons where we have these series of awakenings, it never stops. And I was mindful that you were off social media for a while. And I'd already read your book, and I told you I had it printed down and had my mom read it and a few other people. And it's oh, this is so cool. Magdalene Origins. I highly recommend people read it. But I don't want to speak to what was happening for you at that time. I'm going to let you describe that. But I understood that maybe we were experiencing another parallel in our journeys where you were sort of taking a step back to reassess, what was this whole Magdalene thing? Where do I go from here?
Well, as I mentioned to you, for several years, even leading up to writing the book and that you just referenced, the nudge from the consciousness that is Magdalene, or however we want to explain that relationship, was go back to origins, which kept pushing me back into the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish tradition, what came before, the Hebrew or Israelite, however, you can kind of label it different ways, there are different names for it from the different periods, but that whole Semitic tradition. And I ended up working with some Magdalene mentors who had Jewish connection or were connected to the Hebrew tradition. And so they started getting Hebrew and Aramaic languages into my mouth, into my body. I was drumming and singing in these languages and discovering stories, reading the Sefer Yetzirah, which is one of the earliest mystical texts that we have about the creation of the world using the mystical alphabet and language.
Where is that? Is that Mesopotamian? Is that a Mesopotamian text? A Sumerian?
It is a Jewish text. However, it was written by a group of Jewishly connected people who were probably not rabbinic, and that they were not tied into the mainstream Jewish tradition. And many do believe that they were located somewhere in Mesopotamia at the time of the writing. And there's a lot of, there's so many things about Sefer Yetzirah. Some people believe that Avraham wrote it, as in the great Avraham, father of the people. But that's more the mythic understanding. It was probably written by a group of mystics, over a period of time.
Most of those,
yes, it's more representative.
Most of those early prophets did not write. They had scribes anyway. So
that's exactly.
We were told that they were writing it, you picture, but okay. So So I was getting pushed toward origins, right? And then I write this book, Magdalene Origins, which you read, and I've so appreciated your feedback and support. And not long after that, about the time you saw me go off of social media, I had a very intuitive sense, this would have been late last summer, August maybe, that Magdalene was not going to be guiding me anymore, which was disorienting in some ways and shocking, because
even though I had never felt fully at home in a lot of the mystical communities surrounding Magdalene, it was the closest thing I had to home. And I know that her story and wisdom had guided me this far.
Sure.
And the answer was very simple, because like, well, you're supposed to go into the communities and spaces and places that came before. Like, that's where your path actually lies. And so I was here, or her consciousness was here to be a wayfinder, a way shower to something older.
Which makes
And so it was at that time that I started.
Yeah. If I may just insert that, like what influenced her, right? Like
exactly
her origin.
Who is she really? Where did she come from?
Yeah. What was it like? What was pointing her towards her tradition? So go ahead. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's where I started exploring more. We don't have the Essene tradition, for example. We don't have an unbroken tradition of people today who practice that. People who resurrected it, but and maybe you could argue there's been always a like underground tradition of people secretly practicing, but it's very hard to access things like that. But Jewish tradition has been continuously practiced in one form or another for thousands of years. And so I felt myself being called into Jewish spaces, which was very weird for me at first, because again, those are very traditionally religious spaces. I had come out of traditionally religious spaces, and it's like, do I want to go back into traditionally religious spaces? But I knew that to find out more about origins, and not from the perspective of the tradition I was raised in, or even from the Christian perspective with its Greco-Roman kind of Christ layering, I needed to go somewhere where that wasn't part of the conversation. And what that has ultimately led me to is to really like embrace the Hebrew goddess Asherah and all the wisdom around that, the divine feminine tradition that was lost around that 600 BC period that was so pivotal that we spoke about earlier, that clean break really that happened. Sure. And to go back even further. And now I'm really, really getting excited about and pulling into, as kind of a whole lineage, the Assyrian understanding of the divine feminine and the understanding from Sumer. Because actually a lot of what Shekhinah is in Judaism, or even Chokhmah or wisdom, you can point back to the Assyrian tradition around Ishtar, and a lot of the writings around Inanna, who we have gorgeous poetry about. And she has a very, very, very fierce voice.
Let me just tell you, Inanna, Venus, that mystical connection between Inanna and Venus and the descent journey.
Yeah.
That myth of Inanna, I don't know how literal or historic, whatever, but just the Sumerian text, that people have done different derivatives of that translation, and was so meaningful to me. She put her ear to the great below is a phrase that gives me chills every single time, which is what initiated her descent journey and my own. Great below, not meaning hell or dark or evil like we were taught. Yeah. But the initiation, there's something in her that literally leaned in deep listening. And that's what the feminine does. So anytime anyone mentions Inanna, I'm like, I was finding music about Inanna. I actually went into like a mini mystery school around this, because it was so in line with what I was experiencing in my embodied existence during that unravel.
Yes. And it's just amazing to me that we have access to this again now, after it was buried in sand, on tablets that no one could even decipher for a really long time. That we have access to these stories and traditions, and they are direct foremothers of the Hebrew tradition, which has so influenced in various forms, all of the traditions that we grew up in. And what it has ultimately brought me to appreciate and realize is that Goddess in all of her forms is all over the Hebrew Bible. She's everywhere.
Let me just tell you, like I was like telling you before we started recording, I have this like mug that says "Ask in faith, nothing wavering." I'm like, oh, I have all these things with scriptures on them because I've gathered my whole life. And when I look through the lens of the eternal feminine, Asherah, as you're saying, the great mother, whatever this beautiful lost wisdom tradition was, the scriptures, it's everywhere. but it's been co-opted really by this very linear tradition. So love that you brought up.
Co-opted, hidden. And so I think kind of like to put a package on it from the beginning of my story to this point, that the very text that shaped the way that I grew up and my entire view of the world, even though it was used to wound intentionally and unintentionally by people in my life.
Yeah.
It was also the very thing that I needed to be handed to find her again, ultimately later in life. And that's why I said I've come to like love and value all of Jewish tradition and its insanely detailed commitment to text and language and different things, because it was in the faithful transmission of all of these things, however they were taught over the centuries, that we still hold. In fact, Kabbalah, actually, they say, is probably the closest thing we have left to Assyrian mysticism. And to, the very origins of monotheism are often linked to the Assyrian Empire. And like the Assyrian tree of life is very similar to the Kabbalistic tree of life. And like I realized whenever I enter a Jewish space or work with the Hebrew Bible or work with the Zohar, anything from Kabbalah, I am holding the last living link to these older traditions from Mesopotamia, and they provide a portal. There's much more to discover, but they provide a portal in which to continue going back.
Okay, so if we look at Mesopotamia, which I have come to know, that's where we found all the ancient goddess figurines, text. I mean, before there were people that could actually write with our earliest Sumerian text, And so it's like, there's something happening there. That's like the seedbed of humanity, really, that region of the world. What do you think was there? Like if you could, I mean, after reading all the history and kind of, you were getting your own transmissions intuitively, you were being led, what's there? Like what's the heart of that region, and what is it showing and pointing us to right now?
Well, there's a couple different ways to go with that. But what's coming up for me, immediately as you were saying that is, and by the way, now that I live in this region, I mean, I'm not super close to Sumer, but I'm not super far away either. We share a body.
Wow, yeah, you are. You're closer than most of us.
I'm really close. There is some kind of connection to consciousness beyond this planet. I don't know how else to say it. Okay. I mean, there are many traditions that believe there are stargates in this region, right? And I think that just like probably in Egypt, a lot of the incredible advancement for which we have no explanation may involve forms of life and consciousness that we no longer have access to. I think there was something available in this region. And it's interesting because even how we experience life here and the tremendous transformations and things that are happening here that are going to reposition this region to be in global leadership again in the next couple of decades. I mean, it's already getting there, but even more so, I think is almost like they're still able in some way to tap into that, which I find really interesting. I can't even tell you what that all was. I'm not going to pin myself to some kind of alien consciousness or something. I'm not going to land there. But I just want to appreciate the mystery.
Yeah. The fact that, those goddess figurines, they were like fertility, creation. Yes. And those early Sumerian creation myths are basically like Adam and Eve. They go before this. There's been a creation myth in every tradition. And I'm saying mythos with the utmost respect, because I don't know. It's all a mystery. Yes. It could all be symbolic. I really don't know, but it's something so distinctly masculine, feminine, and beautiful. I want you to speak to the snake consciousness, because you and I talked about this before, which is very Mesopotamian. Yeah. Very linked to the creation myth, very linked to that region of the world. They found snakes everywhere, or snake, symbolism and art with women in that region as well, archaeologically.
Yes.
What's that about, the snake?
Yes. Well, I think if we had a Jungian specialist here or someone who deals in the deeper meanings of the archetypes, they could probably go off into a lot around the constant like shedding and rebirth, the reinvention, a lot of the things around the snake and the connection to the feminine. But for me, it's like, because I have such an orientation toward the Hebrew Bible, I like to go back to Genesis and take a look at those first couple of chapters. Now, on the one hand, when it comes to voice, which we were speaking about earlier, we get this beautiful understanding of how the voice spoken to home, which is the deep, which is really a womb, to seed the womb. The voice seeded the womb, and the world was born, if you want to look at it that way. At the same time, a few turns of story later, we have scribes giving us this narrative of how the evil serpent led the woman astray. And that as punishment, the woman and the serpent, there would be enmity between their two seeds, if you will, or their two lineages.
I will place enmity we could look at the seed of the woman and this. Yeah.
Yes. And now I can look at that and be like, oh, interesting. Here we have a direct, right in the beginning, which my birth tradition, believe was so important. Whatever happens in the beginning is the most important. Well, here we have the disconnection between, literally, I see it as a disconnection between the peoples of Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions are now being disconnected from that snake consciousness, or saying, you don't need this anymore. You have us, and you have language, and you have God in the sky. And I actually think that from a consciousness perspective, we have both. And at one time in Mesopotamia, Hieros Gamos was like so huge. Sacred marriage rituals, the bringing together of masculine and feminine for the perpetuation of the creation was so critical. And I think there's a which we can appreciate and bring together the consciousness, the intuitive consciousness, the subconscious wisdom realm that the snake kind of represents and inhabits, with the conscious structural realm of language. And we can have them both in our lives.
So in saying, maybe this region had so many veils, let's just say, that were not there.
Yes.
Whether that's cosmic or, alien is such a weird word. I don't even know, but
I know, right? I don't like that. It's not my favorite term.
Yeah, I do believe in, I believe is a weird word too, but I do know that there's some truth to the Stargate thing, because I have experienced things in my body, and they feel so cosmic when I go to different places in the world. But
yes,
but let's talk about that snake with the feminine. Why is she holding there's some of the oldest art we have from that region are women holding snakes.
Yes.
So what do you think that is all about from the feminine perspective? The snake.
Gosh, that is a really good question. I honestly have not gone super deep there yet. Like, some of this is like freshly emerging wisdom, but I did just see, to your point, I saw a figurine actually from Canaan, from the region of Israel, recently, that was unearthed, and it was a very plump, very fecund woman with nursing actually two snake children.
Wow.
To your point, and very, very old. I think it was like maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years old. So I'm not sure, but the snake is mysterious, not easily understood, very powerful, shape shifts, and goes through, is very connected and tied to cycles. So these are some very obvious connections that are initially coming up that I've started to sort through in recent weeks.
I love that. And also it's just like the energy of like slithering. Like, here we go into a mystery. Here we go. Are you with me? This is not movement. Easily understood. And it's very feminine the way that flows. But there's something so deep about that dance with Eve and the snake. And what was that really about? What was that actually? Was the serpent so evil? Or did the serpent make more wisdom, make you more? What was that? Truth telling to a degree, like your eyes will be opened if you take this fruit. Well, the snake knew that. The snake embodied some kind of a mystical slithering into, you could call it the descent journey, if we're going back to Inanna. That's what it brings up for me. I've always, everyone's scared of snakes for that reason.
Where does that come from and why?
Like,
yes.
yeah.
But I also think our culture has trained us to see them as a representative of that which is to be feared. Many snakes literally descend into the earth. They may live down there. They may nest down there. There is mystery around them, and therefore the mystery is to be feared. And that goes back to that whole theme we spoke about earlier with how our traditions raised us to think and feel about that. But the snake, ultimately, when you talk about wisdom, it's funny, wisdom pops up again. I always call her the biblical goddess because she is in the text, and she pops up again as Lady Wisdom later in Proverbs, which was probably originally connected to Asherah, because there's a lot of connections between Asherah, happiness, and wisdom making your path straight, and so therefore you're happy. But I often wonder if the snake giving the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, was that the tree of wisdom in the temple? And as Margaret Barker has, a scholar that we both love, has posited, was it the scribes who captured the story? Was it their way of saying, you ate metaphorically of all that intuitive knowledge and mystery wisdom from that tree that we say was shouldn't have been in that holy place? And look where it got you. Look what it's got.
Yeah, and watch out for the feminine, because she'll hand you that apple and say, eat.
100%. Yes.
Yeah. And that's kind of what happened.
We ate the apple, Sheree.
We ate the apple. And then I handed it to my husband, and I'm like, hey, have you considered this? And when his eyes were opened to some of these, we'll just call them false traditions of the fathers. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is all over the scriptures. That's a bad thing, that the traditions of the father, the scriptures actually call the traditions like they couldn't see because of the traditions of their fathers, right? So once his eyes were opened, and I think the feminine in men can drum up that seeking, or our construct, you and I, was the call of the Magdalene, because we were raised Christian, and she was hidden. She was a feminine Christed being who was hidden from our text and driven into this exile that happened in 600 BC. Well, it happened again. Here comes an embodiment of the eternal feminine standing aside the eternal masculine as Yeshua, and driven into complete exile and misunderstood. And now what brings me into such a place of passion and excitement is that there is something shaken up on this earth right now, that people are coming back to what you're speaking of, the wisdom tradition, the ancient of days, as you and I referenced before when we started recording. And what that is actually, it's of this earth and not of this earth. It's cosmic. It's all these things. It's a Shekinah. She's rising. So when you reference voice, don't you feel like the feminine voice is now wanting to come out, and she's been in exile so long that she's like, here we go. Are you ready to speak truth?
Yes. I realized a few months ago, it really became very clear to me that for me personally, part of the next phase is giving voice to those things, really giving voice in a most public way is possible that I can find to these traditions, because she is the voice. Even in Jewish tradition, she's still called Bakol, the daughter of the voice, or this the whisper is like the voice is like the full mother, but then the daughter of the voice is the whisper. And as I mentioned, there's a whole tradition going back into Assyria, Babylonia, and Sumer, even around this whole idea of the feminine as the voice. And any time, the feminine awakening may start in silence, it may start in mystery, it may start in the body and the subconscious, but I think it always intends to break forth. And I do see, just like you mentioned earlier, that there can be some situations where people end up in having a mental break of some kind because they can't maybe process everything that has now shifted in their worldview or something like that. I think it can also happen that sometimes we shut down into greater silence because of all of these shifts. And I've noticed over the last few years that what really actually anchors the change in my life and allows me to create new reality with this new knowledge is when I open my mouth. It's the voice, it is the sound, and that heals me. It anchors me, and it alters the reality in which I live. And anything that I want to create in my life, it starts with that voice. I remember the very first Magdalene mentor I worked with telling me, she said, my best advice for you is, she's like, even as you're shifting, share what is coming to you. Give it out to the world as it's coming to you, and it will evolve over time. Unfortunately, because I was having trouble processing this, I didn't heed that advice. And for several years, I kept it in while I was changing. And then by the time it actually did come out into the open, I had tried to double down for a bit into the community of origin, and then like, oops, now all this knowledge comes out. Well, then there was this huge rupture that would have never happened had I just been using my voice as I felt I could.
Yes, all
along, and heeded her advice to share it, because she knew that in the doing of that, I was healing myself and also anchoring a new reality, the power of vibration.
Wow. And like you said, referencing Genesis, and you and I have shared this with each other, like before, like earlier today, before we started recording, like in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Later it says, the Word was with God, the Word was God. And there's something about that sound, healing, that is so primal. Just sound.
It is,
right?
Very primal.
And if you look even like in the inner worlds, right, that sound inside, it's that presence, the I am, whatever it is, that's speaking life into us, helping us be breathed. It's all so primal. So I know you do drumming, you do chanting, you have this beautiful practice that you employ with getting back to those original sounds. What do you notice in your body, and what do you notice like with the people you work with? Because you worked with me on that when you were helping me with my father wound, which I'm not going to give away because it's going in my book, people, but Lisa herself helped me at the age of 53 to look at my father wound. And it was your sound, when we worked together with sound, and just getting so primal with that. And then, helping me get angry with it and yelling, and you betrayed me, you left me, look what you did, look what you let happen, like all of that. You abandoned me, you rejected me, you're so punitive. Like I got all of that out through sound, through my voice, through yelling in nature, through screaming in a pillow, through my own drum, which I made and strung with my friend Melanie, who is the one who connected us. Shout out to my dear friend Melanie.
Hi, Melanie.
So anyway, that's just my experience with what you offer in terms of vibrational healing, and the primal nature of how that can just strike literally a chord in us to activate healing.
Yes.
What have you noticed in your own body with it? Like what?
What changes?
Yeah, what embodiment piece is there somatically for you, alchemically, when you go into those spaces of chanting and drumming and voicing?
Yeah. Well, at a most immediate level, when I'm actually doing it, I'm transported out of the space that I live in with whatever is going on in that space into the space that I like to call pure creation. It's like pure potentiality. I'm in another place. Once I get really like warmed up and into it, and I'm gone into that other dimension, it's a dimension that doesn't operate on the limitations. It's like the Tehom, it's the deep, right? It's that womb, and I'm sounding into that womb, and I feel safe there. And the constraints that I have in my mind when I'm just walking around and I'm maybe really fully participating in my current view of the reality that I'm in, all those are lifted. Those constraints are lifted, and creation begins there. Almost everything that I've created, that I have found there is true generativity and life around over the last few years, has begun as a result of chanting and drumming and body practice around vibration. And I can say when I first started with Aramaic and Hebrew chanting and drumming several years ago, I the teacher kept challenging us that there's going to be so much shift in your life because of this. And I remember thinking after a couple of weeks, like, well, I'm enjoying it, but I don't know what's shifting. Like I was in such an anxious, like impatient place and almost gave up on it for a while, but I did keep with it. And then it was like in 6 months, I looked back and was shocked at everything that had changed in my life. But it had all happened. It was like growth without striving, as a phrase I heard recently that I absolutely love.
Striving was
like things just fell away and things came.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, yeah. Striving is noble. And
let me just tell you, that word striving is all over Mormon literature. My religion of origin. Strive for exaltation. Strive to be like Jesus. Strive. And that actually impedes growth. So the fact that you shared that this is striving without growth and the primal nature of it gave me a little bit of like, ooh, because I'm actually writing about this, like the whole strive for perfection thing. How that was literally touted as Jesus being the model, right, of perfection, that was touted to strive was touted as pretty much the best thing you can do in the world is keep striving to be like Jesus. And when you go into the feminine nature, there's no striving. When you go into feminine spirituality, there's no striving. So love that. So sound for you was striving without, or growth without striving. Is that what you said?
Yes. Sound is a portal to that. And also it's a portal to wisdom because the sound itself is encoded with wisdom. I personally believe that like sacred languages have been miraculously preserved and used continuously by people for so long because there is some kind of actual power in the language. Hebrew is really what I've delved into over the last 9 months. And I shocked I lived 40 years without it. Like I can't imagine ever being without Hebrew again. Chant and drum and prayer books and reading. I love going into spaces where Hebrew is read, and I mean, it's read in synagogue every week. And this is one of the things I love about that, mindfully taking on that type of practice again of being in a community is the ability to hear the language.
There was a different tonality.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it connects us to these cultures and forms of wisdom that are lost. And I think the language implants something somehow in our bodies through the vibration that we don't even realize we're getting until later, and why are all these Mesopotamian things naturally why has it been coming in? Well, I've been chanting Aramaic, which is a language that was used across the Mesopotamian region for a very long time. I've been chanting for a couple of years in Aramaic now. So I've literally been priming my body for this.
And calling it in, really. Calling it in.
Yes, very much so.
So I love your whole vibe and essence now. And I shared this with you earlier. It's just coming back to the ancient and what's found there, what's so primal for us, what we need at a newborn level, really. What do we actually need? We need mother's milk. We need safety. We need holding. And we also need some kind of structure. We need a house, we need a bed, we need a place to lay. Those provisions you
totally. I'm a fan of those.
Yeah, big fan. And when you look at Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you look at, from at one point you cross from the physical needs to the spiritual. And they actually added a tier on top of his hierarchy of needs, like instead of like just self-realization or a self-actualization, it became self-transcendent. I think transcendental something, or the transcendent, which is the mystery, which is the not knowing. Getting to that place. And this has probably been the most painful part of my journey, to be honest, to be in the unknown, to not have to know everything because it was all handed to me on a silver platter and held up as the truth.
Yeah.
To be in that feminine, slithering snake mystery of knowing but not knowing. Like having a knowing that I'm on the path that is taking me somewhere really beautiful and cosmic and regenerative and affirming and validating with my deep heart longing of devotion and at one with the beloved. It's always been about the beloved for me. And that's what I appreciated about your book, because you ticked every box in the qadosha tradition for me. She's drawn to scents and oils. She's drawn to the rose. She's drawn to this and that. And, everything was like, check, 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 check. The beloved, though, the union with the beloved is the deepest longing that I've come down to, like in just to parse it down for me. And, and so having as many pathways as I can in this existence to reach union with the beloved, sound healing being very much one of them, using my voice, having these kinds of conversations is so incredibly healing for me. But that has been the hardest part, is being in the unknown, while also realizing, in my deep embodied wisdom that being in the unknown is the answer, which is so paradoxical.
It is the answer, and it is the space with no answers. It's interesting. I'm thinking of a rabbi that I worked with recently, a shamanic teacher, actually, who comes from a rabbinic. Originally, he was an Orthodox rabbi. It's a long story, but he left very traditional background, and he's now like a shamanic rabbi. He teaches with Native American wisdom teachers together. It's because he believes the Hebraic and Native American tradition have a lot to share with one another. It's super fascinating. But he actually, the way he shifted was that he was having, as I understand it, the way he's told the story, he was having a crisis of faith, really, about this deeply, extremely conservative and traditional, denomination that he was a part of, that he'd grown up in. And he went to the mountains in Arizona and was in nature. And he thought he would find himself, where he would get all of his answers to his questions, all these things about, like, what should I do? And should I remain a rabbi, and all of this. And he said that he realized when he got there that when he was in the mystery, in nature, there were no questions. He didn't have the questions. He didn't need the answers because the questions were gone. And so he ended up just never coming back from the mountains. And he's been teaching there ever since. But I think what you said, like, it made me think of that story, just that once you're in that space, and we can, nature is a great sort of metaphor or parallel for that mystery. We have the answer because there are no questions. And I've realized that one of the greatest aspects of my journey in recent years, ever since that divorce that catalyzed me into this process of being able to ask these questions 7 years ago, was that I had to learn how to move confidently into the mystery at all times. And it is sound. It is both the divine voice, or the inner voice, however you want to look at that, that we have to listen for. And also the activation of our authentic voice that allows us to call our path into being at all times out of the mystery. And when it hit me that the unknown and sound or language or, the vibration have to work together. This is part of that sacred marriage, right, that we were talking about earlier. That the sound, that the vibration, the call, whether it was the inner call or an actual physical call. And that's the other thing with sacred language. If you don't know what you want to say yet, or you can't even give voice to the anguish that you feel, or what's going on in your dark night of the soul, or anything else, sacred language gives you an ability to sound and to speak and to call things into being when you don't even have your own words yet. Eventually you'll have them. Maybe you'll write your own songs, you write your own chants, all of these things.
Even that word,
but however we're getting that.
Yeah, I have a whole meditation thing with just ma, which is a very primal sound. Yeah. It's very feminine, of course. Ma,
very primal.
Babies, that's the first sound they make. So as we kind of wrap up, I would love for you to share with our listeners just something practical they can employ with sound. Because actually, Lisa, I didn't know we were going to be diving so deeply into the mystery of sound, but I have a sense we were. But that's a lot of what I'm writing about, is giving rise to the feminine voice, and how healing that is, and how my journey has worked into speak and sound and speaking life, if you will. That's the Christian term, speak life over something. When you were talking about moving confidently into the mystery, it's so beautiful. I had another scripture. You have no idea how many scriptures are in my head, but I had one scripture that's like going boldly before the throne of grace. I think it was either Paul. It was Paul, like God's glory being manifest in your weakness, but you go boldly before the throne of grace is so rich now for me. It's so feminine. It speaks to not the old, maybe patriarchal tradition of that scripture, but more like, oh, let's move into grace boldly, which is all mystery. It's all mystery. So when you're talking to somebody about doing something practical, let's just say something they can incorporate into maybe their normal daily devotional practice or just on the run, maybe. What's your sort of go-to get started for people who are like, oh, I want to do sound healing. I want to speak life. I want to create with sound. How would they go about that?
One of the easiest things to do is like just take one word from sacred language and chant it. You can use any tune you want, or you can just say it. You can just tone it in the same tone. A word I like to use, and it's a word I use a lot, is shlama, which, you can just tone as shlama, and you can, however long you can hold the breath, see if you can lengthen how long you can hold the breath in those 2 syllables. You'll notice that it changes as you tone it over time. And again, if you want to sing it in some type of pattern, you can, or you can just tone. But that word,
left brain people, SHALAMA. SHLA.
So shla is the first part, and then ma. Speaking of your word, ma is the second half of that word, and that is Aramaic for. It's usually translated peace. It's like shalom in Hebrew, but the actual meaning of it is wholeness. Ooh. And I don't know, I can always use more wholeness. Yeah. And I have found at times when I am feeling fragmented for whatever reason, or I'm feeling like I've lost a piece of myself, or I let something go that, from myself that maybe I didn't want to, and I would like to call it back. This word is like a homing signal for, like these pieces of myself, they come. And generally, I usually say, try to, when you're starting out, tone a word for 4 minutes. Obviously, you can take as many breaths as you need to, but that gives time for the sound and the meaning to actually kind of soak into your being. Try 4 minutes a day for 21 days and see what happens.
Wow.
Or you can pick another word if you know a word. Yeah.
I'm going to report to everyone, because by the time that this airs, it'll be more than 21 days. So I'm doing it.
Yeah.
And you were the one that introduced that word to me. And, it's so interesting because I shared this with you before, and maybe we can wrap with this, but I think for some of us, there's a fear response, even though it's our deepest craving. Here's the paradox. Our deepest craving is to have that union. Our deepest craving is to connect to the deepest part of ourselves, to be in that place where that man, the shaman Hebrew guy that you're talking about, or the Native American, to be in nature and all questions just dissolve, because you're just you're in connection. You're there. There's no striving, right? Yeah. I think that there has just been this like underlying fear that I have been trying to heal all this time around that connection, even though it's the thing I crave the most. There's some, you could call it generational terror, being in the presence of God held some kind of unworthy, bow down, I'm not supposed to be here, I can't see the face of God and live. That kind of, I'm not worthy, I'm not ready, let me tidy things. I'm just speaking out, like brain dumping what that's about. I'm sure there's more to it that I'm not aware of. So what will this help with that reticence, if you will, to move into presence? Will that, like, what do you experience when people, I know part of it is calling back pieces of you and wholeness and whatever, but part of that is God. Part of that is connecting back to the God within, the God of creator of all. So the fear.
Yes. I like to think of this as the long corridor into presence. It's very hard. I mean, I know you're speaking on a larger level of like just that general fear of being in the presence and whatnot, but also practically on a day-to-day basis. It's very hard to go from like this conversation directly into presence. Very difficult. And for me, chant, drum, anything like this, and your voice is always with you. It's in your body. It's not going away. Usually, it's not going away. I mean, it could, but most of the time, it doesn't for most people. And it's there, and it becomes like this corridor. The minute you begin to use your voice in this way, you're opening space. And even if you can't fully bring your body into this, ultimately the vibration and the way that your sympathetic nervous system like calms when you're breathing and chanting and things, it will make that space for you. And it's funny, I walked the path of uncertainty and mystery for several years without these tools. And I did it, but I was constantly a little fractured inside and anxious, doubting myself and whatnot. And I have now walked the path of mystery for several years with these tools. And I don't know how, and I can only attribute it to the sound work, really. But I can now be in that space of mystery, even with how my life is going to unfold next week. Or next month, with such a sense of softness and trust. And I do believe that this sound work, because you're constantly calling in, you're calling in that presence, and you're calling in a new reality, even into your own body. Every time your cells are regenerating, right? Like, I mean, now you're singing over them, you're chanting, you're toning. It's going to be completely different.
You feel a little awkward when you're drumming and you're like, this is so weird. This is so out of the box. This is like, I'm saying weird stuff and I'm drum and stuff's coming, and you've got to get past that barrier. It's an imaginary audience. Yes. You're alone when you're doing this. It's just you and this practice. And I put it away. You're the one that introduced me to all this sound healing stuff, really at the primal language level. I mean, I've done sound healing in multiple ways, with drumming and chanting and things, and mantras really. But yeah, it's the battle between your ears. It's like, oh, this is so weird. This is so weird. And getting past that barrier into, well, why am I doing this? And what is my true intention? And I think intention gets overused, but you know what I mean? Like we can get caught up too much in intention and miss what's trying to come through. But if your heart is in the space of wanting to receive and be at one, I think that you can hold that. Is there something that you do to get into the zone of, like, let's say you don't feel like doing it. Let's say you're like, I know this brings me into presence, but maybe I'm in apathy and I don't want to be in presence. And that's maybe the time you need to do it the most. But how do you break through that yourself?
It is. I think usually it's starting with something small, like, because I drum, and I know you do as well, a heartbeat drumming pattern, for example, which is like four patterns of 4 counts where you're breathing in, and then 4 patterns of 4 counts where you breathe out. And all you're doing is just counting, basically beating the pattern with the drum. That just feels good after you've done it for a few seconds. And I find that, like, if I can get myself to do that, like on the days when I am feeling, many days I don't have any resistance now because it's normal in my life, but there was a time when I did. And there are still days where I do have, especially if I've been busy or whatever. I find if I just sit down and do that, that was great. Well, all I had to do was bang and breathe. Is really all I had to do. Okay, well then I guess we can sing. Oh, okay, we can chant some more. Oh, I could sing this. I haven't done that in a while. And it just kind of flows from there.
So that kind of breaks up. Okay, cool. Well, yes. I have loved where we've gone here, and enjoy hearing more and more about how my journey is paralleling yours, and finding more and more women who are in the throes of the mystery and being on such a devotional path. I'm just built that way. Like, I have a heart of devotion to God and Christ and everything that represents. It's just in me. And I'm grateful for the programming I received early in life to reinforce that, but I think I came that way anyway and took everything so seriously because, the sacred longing to have that presence with me is not going away, even though I've changed spaces with the religion piece of it. It's just, it hasn't left. It's not going anywhere. It's just there. And when I try to run from it, it pulls me back, which is beautiful. So, Lisa, where can people find your, well, first of all, any parting words, like all things considered, every direction we went, if you could leave us with some kind of parting message to those who may be on this journey of the unknown, and then tell people where they can find your work online.
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing that's coming up for me is that your soul knows. It just does. Even if your mind is fighting whatever you're working through or what you've been called to or drawn to, your soul knows, but it's your voice that shows the way. The soul knows, the voice shows. I like to say, and it's a little bit of a paradox because, of course, your voice doesn't see anything, but it's literally how you find your way through the dark. Both the voice you hear within and also the voice that you then release forth into the world, which calls in everything else and makes the next step apparent. So trust that and let your voice lead the way and let voice lead the way. In terms of finding me, I am at templeofdivineradiance.com. And I'm also at Temple of Divine Radiance on Instagram. Those are the two best places to get connected. However, I will say that Temple of Divine Radiance, the website will always be there, but I am going to be introducing a space to kind of house all of this work around uncertainty, voice, and the Mesopotamian feminine tradition. Lisa Moriah, LisaMoriah.com very soon. So by the time this episode airs, it might be live. And if not, people listening to it in the future will probably find that as kind of a better space to go for everything. But at this very moment, Temple of Divine Radiance is the best place to find me.
And it's a beautiful space, just so everyone knows, calling you to your inner temple. For those of us who were taught that outer temples were the way to God and the only way to God, coming back home to the temple within and the holiness of the Holy of Holies really is your work, and it's gorgeous. So thank you so much for your time today. This has been, oh my gosh, so like lighting up my soul. You have no idea.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. This was an incredible joy for me. And it's the first time I've gotten to speak about some of these things from the very recent journey. So I especially appreciate you providing that space for voice and story to come forth.
You'll always have a space here. I love your work. I think what's really fascinating to me about Lisa's journey is, for so many years having struggled with the effects of what she calls power-based empire theologies on her body, her heart, her mind, her psyche as a woman. So sometimes the very words that wound us, we can also extrapolate words that heal. And, for thousands of years, these sacred texts have been used as tools to wield control. And when you deepen into the wisdom teachings, especially as you go back to the Aramaic and some of these really early languages, we see something totally different emerge, and it's very feminine based. So we really honor Lisa and her work, and I invite you to continue to follow her at templeofdivineradiance.com. I am super excited because I have a drum that I actually sent to Megan Orr Burnside, who is painting it for me, and I'm going to be revealing that soon. So excited to get my drum back. My friend Melanie Cannon helped me create this drum, and after my interview with Lisa, I was ever more determined and inspired, I should say, to put into practice shalama, Aramaic for wholeness, which is, for 4 minutes a day for 21 days, 4 beats of the drum inhale, and then 4 beats on the drum for the exhale, bringing us back into this, what Lisa calls the long corridor of divine presence, which gives us that sense of safety and trust within ourselves, trusting that the voice leads the way. The soul knows, the voice shows. All of these words I get from Lisa because she just so eloquently describes how powerful voice really is. So I extend my love and faith in you and your voice leading the way, showing the way, and rooting you into this new reality of wisdom, power, and love as our divine template emerges through these beautiful qualities of sound. Thank you for listening. We will talk to you next time on Stand, Speak, Shine podcast.